While I've talked about potential balance changes for Splatoon 3 a ton, a concept I've barely mentioned since 2019 is Weapon Reworks, which is not only something really interesting going into Splatoon 3, but something that we've seen a few times going from Splatoon 1 to 2. While normal balance changes add or take away from a weapon's kit, reworks are doing much more drastic changes that can make the weapon feel fundamentally different or give it key attributes that it never had in the first place. So today we're going to go over the existing reworks that have happened from Splatoon 1 to 2 and what I'd want to see in Splatoon 3. I hope you all enjoy. Let's start off with the best rework we've had so far, which is Dual Squelcher to Dualie Squelcher from Splatoon 1 to 2. Dual Squelcher was a fairly average mid-range shooter that had a solid paint and fire rate, but a pretty slow kill time and fairly average mobility. It didn't really have any main standout features, and the main reason it did see some use were its kits, mainly the custom one with Beacon and Killer Whale. While Dual Squelcher had its fans, outside of the kit it didn't really have any major reason to be used, and later into the game's lifespan would become extremely unpopular, where even the kit stopped really having any major purpose. Because of this, going into Splatoon 2, we saw the rise of the Dualie Squelcher. On launch, Dualie Squelcher had the longest distance dodge rolls in the game, and a short patch afterward, these rolls would turn into slides. This not only gave them insane mobility, but players also discovered you could jump after those rolls for an added option. While the transition from shooter to Dualie added a lot of small changes for the weapon, the main thing is this brand new mobility. This is an aspect that everyone knows Dualie Squelcher for, but the original Dual Squelcher never had anything close to. This is how powerful reworks are. Dualie Squelcher went from something that had no reason to be used whatsoever and didn't stand out in any way to having some of the most exceptional mobility in the game, especially for the amount of range it has, which led to it being a top tier pick throughout the game's life cycle. Reworks are a lot more drastic, and while this did make the weapon really strong, overall this made Squelcher a much more interesting weapon with an insanely high skill ceiling, and so it's one of the most popular ones in Splatoon 2. A good rework really adds something new to the weapon, giving people a reason to try it out, though a bad rework can do exactly the opposite. So let's talk about Octobrush. In Splatoon 2, this weapon is fairly average. It has some rolling mobility, which is pretty useful, but it's nothing super exceptional. Its kill time is fairly average, but it does have a really large size hitbox and a decent paint output. Octobrush's main standout point is its Kensa kit, with the Suction and Ultra Stamp being really good at damaging objects like Tent Shield or the Rainmaker Shield. But outside of that, the weapon's really outclassed by other big hitbox options. In particular, Tri-Slosher has a faster kill time, a bit more range, and is still fairly mobile even without a roll. However, in Splatoon 1, Octobrush had a really defined niche that made it super good in the right situations, mainly because of its damage. Octobrush had damage overlapping, where the flicks and the ink that came out of it could both hit. When combined with a little bit of damage up, this meant Octobrush had two-shot potential. But not only that, it also had the highest DPS in the game, making it great in the mode of Rainmaker. While some people might say the kit of Beacon and Kraken were the main reason it was used, that kit was also on the Krakon roller, which was not in a bad spot in Splatoon 1 for most of the game. Octobrush really was just a better main weapon option that fit the niche better. While the two-shot may seem obnoxious, you had to be incredibly close to your opponent in order to get that, so Octobrush was super dependent on being able to close the gap as well as abusing its unique damage per second, making it stand out from rollers, while also having a higher skill ceiling than it did in the second game. These are the only two main weapon reworks Splatoon has ever had, and they're basically the same story, but in reverse of each other. Dual Squelcher went from a weapon that had no reason to be used to Dualie Squelcher with unique strengths, while Octobrush went from something that had a unique strength to a more well-rounded but overall bland weapon that didn't really have a big reason to be used outside of a weapon kit. As an Octobrush player, I totally get if Nintendo didn't like the idea of the two-shot and wanted to get rid of it, but you have to give it something to stand out, and it just didn't get any of that. And while I still enjoy Octobrush in Splatoon 2, it doesn't have the same feeling as it did in the first game. There are a few candidates to be reworked in Splatoon 3. The Blob and Aerospray would probably be prime examples, with the Aerospray being outclassed by Junior and Bloblobber being too paint spammy. But I think these weapons more just need some minor changes, Blob stopping its paint spammy nature, and Aerospray given something to stand out like they did with Junior's larger ink tank. The one weapon I do want to be reworked in Splatoon 3 is Gootuber. It's basically in the same spot as Splat 1 Dual Squelcher, where it doesn't really stand out from its counterparts and can be turned into a new similar weapon class, in this case, the bow. The Tri-Shot would of course help it stand out from Squiffer among the other smaller changes bows would bring from chargers, but the main thing would be the incredible strafe speed we know bows have. That alone would be a really interesting change to give it reasons to see use over Squiffer, let alone it being a different weapon class as a whole. Plus, if there's anything we've learned from Dualie Squelcher, giving something mobility is a pretty cool buff that really helps out. But that's just main weapons. Technically, there are two other reworks that have happened between games, to Sprinkler and Disruptor/Toxic Mist. Toxic Mist is one of the simplest reworks out there. It's the same kind of effect, except a little bit stronger, and it stays in a certain position rather than attaching to players. It's a simple one that I think works quite well, and though I think a little bit more complexity could be added to the sub-weapon, I'd argue that it's still a positive change, considering Disruptor was an unbelievably broken mess. Sprinkler, on the other hand, is a lot more interesting. Originally for Splatoon 1, Sprinkler just painted really simply, and it did a solid amount of damage. It's basically the equivalent of a turret in other games, except it focuses more on paint control than damaging opponents. It was a fairly average sub, but it worked fine on the right weapons like Vanilla Dynamo. However, it seems Nintendo didn't really like it because they changed it a good bit going into Splatoon 2. The damage was not only made weaker, but the sub was made to have cycles. It would have one mode that lasted around 5 seconds and painted a lot, a second mode that painted a bit worse for 15 seconds, and then it would transition to mode 3, where it would barely paint whatsoever. Sprinkler was actually pretty good at the start of Splatoon 2, and then they nerfed its paint output, making the sub cheaper, I guess, to make up for it, and the sub became pretty bad for the remainder of the game's lifespan, including to this day. I'm honestly really curious what they're gonna do for this sub, because they've reworked it and changed it quite a lot, and it's managed to be really bad or average at best. Maybe they won't bring it in the next game at all, or maybe they're gonna change it again for a third time. Who knows? Personally, while I can understand doing modes as having a deployable sub that does things constantly can be annoying, Sprinkler really only paints. It's not really the same thing as damaging opponents, and I think it honestly worked fine in Splatoon 1. So personally, I hope they just revert it and leave it at that. I don't want to spend too much time on abilities because outside of turning bomb range up and special duration up into sub power up and special power up, basically giving them effects other than duration, there hasn't really been any direct reworks on abilities. The most interesting part of this discussion, though, is specials, because Nintendo's never really reworked specials before. And no, I don't count Bomb Launcher as a reworked Bomb Rush, they just added more throwing range. That's just a change. I really don't consider it that significant. Splatoon 2 specials were made to be all new from 1, so obviously they weren't going to be reworked. However, Splatoon 3 is introducing our first special rework with the Tri-Zuka, a reworked version of the Splatoon 1 Ink-Zuka. While fairly similar to its original counterpart, it now shoots bursts of shots that act a bit differently, and you only have 3 shots. Splatoon 1 Ink-Zuka and most specials seem to be based off of duration, but I'm guessing with only 3 shots, they might give you a bit more firing time, closer to 8 seconds for the Tri-Zuka, which would make it a lot more interesting. Obviously, the duration factor is still there, but it's much more about picking which shots you take since you have so few of them, but more time to make them, even if they don't extend the duration past the original 6.5 seconds. Side note, the Zipcaster also has a more unique mechanic where you recall after your ink tank runs out, something that they've both stated and we've seen in the original trailer. Anyway, as of right now, we don't know the majority of Splatoon 3's special weapons, and I think it's going to be really interesting to see what they do, considering pretty much any returning special from 1 or 2 will probably need some form of rework, mainly in the counterplay department. So I'm really curious if we're going to see more reworked special weapons and how Nintendo's going to do with them, considering it's never really something they've had to do in either game before. Reworks in Splatoon have a small and fairly mixed history, and I'm hoping going into Splatoon 3 that we really see some interesting reworks that continue to add to the game. We'll just have to wait and see.